Okay, so I can see that people are still trickling in a little bit. So maybe I'll introduce and we can have a slow start to this evening's session. So hi everybody and welcome. I'm Sandra Mathers from the University of Oxford, and it's really great to have so many of you here tonight. We have around 250 people booked on tonight, most of you early years practitioners, but also researchers and a collection of other people from the early years world. So thank you for making the time to hear about our research, especially after what I'm sure has already been quite a busy day. I'm going to share the results from our latest study, which explored the tricky dilemma of how we capture the knowledge that those of you working with young children use every day in your interactions. So I will be sharing the research, but I'll try and keep it really accessible and practice focused. And those of you who'd like more details about the measurement and analysis side of things, then I'll be sharing the full report afterwards by email. So this is our team. We've got a lot of these people with us here this evening. So Ariel and Lars and Julian were my co-investigators on the research team, and we've also had a fantastic advisory group, 3 of whom are going to be speaking tonight. So we're really lucky to have with us Professor Kathy Silver, Dr. Leslie Curtis and Beatrice Merrick, who are going to join me later on the panel. So this evening I'm planning to talk for around half an hour. And then we'll hear from Leslie, Beatrice and Kathy with their responses to the research. And then I hope that we'll have 10 to 15 minutes, if everything goes to plan, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. So if you have questions, if you could type them into the Q&A as you think of them, that would be really great. So we can see them more easily there than in the chat. So we'll try and get people on to ask their questions later, if we can make the technology work. If you'd rather not, that's also completely fine. If you just want to put your question in the chat, then I'm really happy to read it out for you, whatever you feel comfortable with. So we probably won't have time if we have a lot to answer them all tonight, but we can create a bank of questions and responses and then share those afterwards. So before I move on, then just to note several other people on the slide to whom we owe thanks. So including, of course, the Nuffield Foundation for funding the research, very important. Okay, so I'll start by reminding us why we care so much about children's early language skills. And it's hard really to overstate their importance. So they set the foundation for social communication, for relationships, for literacy and for children's learning in all areas of development. But we know that many young children start school without the language skills they need, with some already a year or more behind their peers at school entry. And we know that without help, these children might never catch up, with really serious consequences for their outcomes throughout life. But the good news is that high quality preschool experiences can help these children catch up and develop the foundational language skills that they need, with adult-child interactions really being the most powerful factor. So I thought we might start by watching an expert at work. I'm going to show you a video of Leslie supporting 2 young children at Peter Pan Nursery School in Bedford, different Leslie. Now I don't know what your internet connections are like this evening. So if you have trouble seeing the visual, then if you concentrate on the audio, then you'll get a really good sense of it. Here we go. Let's see how we get on.
Mummy's at work now, isn't she?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, let's have a look here. Do you want me to read this to you? Okay. She found a cottage with a beautiful garden.
Oh.
There's the garden. Can you see there's some trees and some flowers? My house?
Yeah.
My house doesn't look like this. My house has got a flat roof. A flat roof.
Yeah.
I would like a house like this. Would you?
Go away.
And it's got a wooden door.
I go. Yeah, go away.
Is that his house? Is that your house, Cole? Is this your house? Oh, you've got some trees in your garden.
Yeah. I'm going to go away.
That's Goldilocks. She's naughty, knocking on the door and going inside the house. She's saying,
I'm going to go.
shouldn't be going in people's houses. Oh, what has she found? It's not very safe to go into people's houses, is it?
No.
No, not when nobody's there.
Ow.
She should go out.
Yeah.
All right. But what does she see on the table?
Okay.
She sees some porridge.
Yeah.
Yum.
I'm going to
She's going to try this one.
go.
And is it too hot?
Yeah.
Too hot.
Go get your one.
And this one,
Yeah.
too cold. Oh, too cold.
Go get it.
And this one,
Yeah, baby.
yummy. Just right.
Okay, so I'd love to watch the whole thing. I always come away from this video smiling. But I hope that you've got the gist of what Leslie was doing with the two boys here. And really, although she makes it look easy, there's actually something incredibly complex going on here. So Leslie's balancing lots of different sources of information to make in the moment decisions about how to support these children's oral language. So she's balancing knowledge and beliefs about effective pedagogy, about how children learn, her understanding of peer interactions and dynamics, knowledge of these two specific boys and her history with them, her goals for teaching and learning, factors relating to the school context, and of course the children's actual responses. Now, that all happens so smoothly that, as I said, she makes it look really easy. Now, what I'm interested in is the knowledge that makes that possible. So this is pedagogical knowledge, knowledge of teaching practice. But it's not the kind of theoretical knowledge that one can write on paper. It's live knowledge, dynamic pedagogical knowledge, that usable knowledge that supports us in the moment decision making during interactions with children. Now, some people might think of this as skill. Kathy and I have debated this quite a bit, but I think it sits just before skill. So it's the knowledge an educator needs to perform a skill. So what we want to know is, how is it that one practitioner, how does Leslie know just what to do in a specific moment, but somebody else maybe doesn't, or maybe applies a strategy that's less powerful, less impactful for children's language learning? And these are the sorts of questions that we've been addressing in our research. So what kind of knowledge does Leslie have? What does that look like? What aspects of knowledge are most important for child outcomes? And how can we help other people to develop that knowledge? So the problem is, of course, that knowledge is invisible. So it's very hard to measure. So we can see this in the research studies that have been carried out so far. So there have been studies which have successfully measured content knowledge, so knowledge about what we need to teach. So in terms of early language, that might be vocabulary or verbs or tenses and so on, and what children need to know at each age and stage. Now, that's quite straightforward to measure using something like a questionnaire, and studies have shown that that kind of content knowledge matters for child outcomes. But when it comes to pedagogical knowledge, so knowledge of how to teach that content, then there have been far fewer studies, and the kinds of studies that do exist haven't actually found many associations with quality of practice or with child outcomes. And that's quite puzzling, because theoretically and also from our knowledge of practice, we know that that live dynamic knowledge of pedagogy matters. It's not enough just to have theoretical knowledge and facts. But the problem is if we can't measure that knowledge, then it doesn't get valued. And we've got no research which says that that dynamic, flexible knowledge, which you all and which Leslie develop and use every day with your children, matters for child outcomes. So we've got a twin problem. Expert practitioners make it look easy, and also it's quite hard to measure properly. So this really amazingly complex knowledge that many of you here tonight use in your settings every day doesn't get valued. And because of that, it's also not a policy priority. So we do have now actually many more research studies that are exploring what works for professional development. So the Eyfp is doing a really great job on that front, for example, but most studies still only measure whether a particular program has an impact on child outcomes, and maybe some assess impact on practice, but very few of them include measures of the kind of professional knowledge and growth which leads to those changes for children. And so that means that the educators themselves and their expertise aren't really being studied. That means that we miss a great deal of really important information about how to design professional development to be most effective. And personally, I think it also devalues the role of educators. So we're really not capturing that incredibly complex professional knowledge. We're not recognizing it because we're not measuring it. A small slide coordination issue. So there are lots of things then that we still need to know about pedagogical knowledge, and this study is answering part of the puzzle, so the part that is here on the slide. So does pedagogical knowledge matter for child language outcomes, and if it does, then what kind of knowledge is most important? Now, there are other questions that we could ask. So we also need to know how to improve knowledge through professional development, and also to understand the role of quality. So does knowledge improve quality, which improves child outcomes, for example? But those questions are for later. So for now, we're going to focus on that relationship with child outcomes. Now, of course, if we are going to study pedagogical knowledge, then we have to be able to measure it first. So how is it then that we capture the knowledge that is underpinning Leslie's in the moment decision making? Now, up to this point, most studies have tended to use questionnaires to measure knowledge. And just have a read of the question on the slide here. So this is from a previous questionnaire for measuring knowledge. What do you think the right answer is here? So apparently it's option C, but hopefully you can see right away how limited this is as a measure of practice knowledge, because there just isn't one correct strategy that applies in every situation. And the choice that a practitioner makes in a specific interaction is going to depend on lots of different factors, like we saw earlier with Leslie. So we used an alternative approach instead, based on videos of real classroom interactions. So like the clip that we watched of Leslie, practitioners get shown a series of short clips, and then they're asked to identify or to interpret teaching practice or children's responses and thinking. And the idea is that that's a more authentic context for measuring knowledge and much closer to the context of what goes on in actual practice. So it should, we hope, get us closer to capturing not just what practitioners know in theory, but the kind of dynamic knowledge that they can access and activate and use during real classroom interactions. So our thinking was that that ought to be a better predictor of what educators actually do in practice the knowledge as measured by a questionnaire. So the Observing Language Pedagogy Instrument, or OLP, thinking every time I read this now, we could have picked a snappier title, but anyway, the OLP uses video to capture early educators' knowledge of language supporting strategies. It's the first tool to do that, and we designed it to be quite brief so that we could use it in research without putting a big burden on respondents. And the aim of the OLP is to elicit practitioners' knowledge of language supporting strategies, and specifically their ability to identify and interpret strategies in video interactions. So people responding to the OLP, they watch 2 short videos. So one, you can see the pictures there, one with an adult and child in the block area, and then the second, a small group discussing and drawing a shopping list. And then they're asked to identify up to 8 strategies likely to support children's language development. So you can see some of the sample responses here in blue. I'll just give you a minute to have a look at those. Okay, so then we coded those responses to reflect 3 different aspects of knowledge. So perceiving is the extent to which educators could identify language supporting strategies in the videos. So, for example, describes the child's actions using gestures or uses how and why questions, and that captured their strategy knowledge. But because they could choose to report any strategy, it also captured their ability to identify which strategy was likely to be most important for child language in that specific context. Naming captured whether respondents used expert vocabulary to describe the strategies. So, for example, gives a running commentary on the child's actions, or uses open questions instead of the more informal how and why questions. So that captures the more formal and explicit knowledge, and maybe also attendance at previous professional development. And then finally, interpreting measured how often respondents gave an interpretation. So, for example, suggesting why a teacher might have used a strategy, or what effect it had on the child, or suggesting a possible alternative approach. So, for example, uses gestures to reinforce the meaning of a new word, or repeating and adding detail to extend the child's vocabulary. So these respondents could connect their knowledge about children and their knowledge about pedagogy. They knew why as well as how, essentially. So just take a minute. I suppose you've all read the summary of the research, haven't you? So it's not so much of a surprise, but what would you predict would be the most important of those factors? Have a little ponder before we move on. And for the researchers among you in the audience, we used confirmatory factor analysis to test that structure, and found that the factors could be distinguished empirically, and that knowledge was better represented by those 3 facets separately than by a single factor. Okay, so now that we have got a measure of pedagogical knowledge, then how did we test whether it matters for children's language outcomes? Now, what we wanted to know, I guess, is whether children who have educators with greater knowledge make more progress in their oral language than children with less knowledgeable educators. And we used data from an existing randomized controlled trial designed to evaluate a professional development programme. And that the trial participants there were nursery and reception class teachers in primary schools. The children were in the study from the start of their nursery year on the left there, you can see, to the end of their reception year on the right. And for this analysis, we used a data set of just under 800 children whose reception class teachers, 70 of them, had completed the OLP to explore that question. So to explore whether teachers with more knowledge had children with better oral language and than teachers with less knowledge at age 5. So in the box on the right, you can see that at age 5, we had language assessments completed by researchers from the RCT, and also early years foundation stage results for each child. And then on the left, in the orange, you can see that we controlled for children's language at age 3. So in effect, we were predicting children's language progress across the 2 years of the EYFS. And we controlled for a range of other child and teacher and school factors which might have influenced children's language progress. So, for example, whether children had a special educational need, spoke English as an additional language, were eligible for free school meals, and so on. Now, I should probably just mention a limitation of the data set here. So while we did know about the knowledge of children's reception class teachers, we unfortunately didn't have the same information about the children's nursery teachers. So there was a gap there. So this just shows the language outcome measures in more detail. Don't need to talk about this in great detail. So the researcher measures at the top there captured children's understanding of vocabulary and grammar in blue, and also their spoken vocabulary and grammar in green. So researchers, I'm sure you'll recognise the measures that are listed here. And then for the EYFSP, we had scores for good level of development, for communication and language, and for literacy. Okay, so now we come to the results. Now, don't panic if you're not a numbers person. I'll talk you through these graphs. So each graph here represents one of those researcher administered language outcomes. And the bars basically show how strongly each aspect of knowledge predicted that outcome at age 5. So perceiving in blue, naming in orange, interpreting in green. So don't worry about the scale. The important thing here is the comparison between the height of the bars. So you can see that the blue and green bars are the tallest. So perceiving and interpreting were the best predictors of language outcomes. And those effects were seen most strongly for children's understanding of language. So the 2 graphs at the top. And you can see there on the top 2 graphs that statistically significant effects are marked with the stars. So if you look top left, you can see one significant effect for perceiving on vocabulary, that's in blue. And then across that top row, you can see 2 effects for interpreting in green, both for vocabulary and for grammar. So basically, that means that teachers who are better at identifying or perceiving the relevant language supporting strategies in the videos had children who made more progress in their understanding of vocabulary across the EYFS. And teachers who were better at interpreting the videos had children who made more progress in their understanding of vocabulary and their understanding of grammar as well. Now, in the analysis on the previous slide, we ran separate models for each OLP factor. Now, the best test of which aspects of knowledge are most important for child outcomes is to include all of the aspects in the same statistical model. So they have to fight it out, if you like. So we ran this combined analysis for understanding of vocabulary and grammar where there'd been significant individual effects. And this graph shows the combined model for children's understanding of vocabulary. So really the important thing here is that the strongest effect by quite a long way was found for interpreting. Researchers, you're probably thinking about the effect size. So the effects were small, all around 0.1 of a standard deviation, but still important, I think, given the context. So what does that mean? Well, first up, it means that early educators' knowledge of language supporting strategies does matter for young children's language outcomes. So teachers' ability to identify and to interpret the language supporting strategies predicted gains in children's understanding of vocabulary and grammar between age 3 and 5, with interpreting being the strongest predictor. So that means really that knowing which strategy is important or appropriate in a specific context, that does matter, but knowing why those strategies might be effective matters more for child language outcomes. So we'll come back to think about that in more depth in a minute. But lastly, naming, so that use of expert terms, did not predict child language. Now, kind of makes sense if you think about it. So use of specialist terms will vary quite a lot. So different practitioners will use different terminology depending on where they trained, when they trained, which professional development courses they've attended, and so on. But the important thing is that knowing the right words didn't really matter a lot for child language. So a quick review then of where we found the effects. So there were stronger associations between knowledge and children's understanding of language than with the spoken language. So that might be because children's spoken language is more difficult to influence, or it might be due to differences between the measures that we used. So you can find more details on that in the report if you're interested. And we found no effects of knowledge on Eyfp scores. Now, that's actually not unusual in research, and that is likely to be a measurement issue. So researcher-administered tests have less noise in the data, essentially, because they're carried out by a really small team trained to be consistent with each other. Now, Eyfp data is obviously really important for assessing children's progress, but it's not such a robust measure for research because, of course, it's completed by lots of different people, and that makes it more difficult to detect effects in statistical analysis. So the headline then, really the takeaway from this evening, is that interpretation of those videos was the best predictor of language. So I guess the next question to ask then is if interpretation matters, then what is it exactly? What does that look like, and how do we do it? So these were the kinds of responses that were given by the teachers who offered interpretations of the videos. So they offered suggestions or observations about pedagogical intention. So why the educator might have been using a particular strategy. So talks through the child's actions to reinforce oral language, uses a gesture to clarify an unknown word, for example. Or they might have noted and recorded an effect on the child. So the teacher models how to use narrative skills to describe what the child's doing. This is then copied by the child, and she's able to narrate what she's doing and the effect it was having on the speed of the car. Or some suggested possible decision-making on the part of the adult in the video. So, for example, she extended vocabulary using faster and slower rather than fast and slow. So the common factor really in these responses was that educators were linking their knowledge of child development and their knowledge of pedagogy, and they did this spontaneously. So we didn't prompt specifically for an interpretation. We just asked educators to tell us what strategies were being used. So that means really that their knowledge was close to the surface. It was ready for activation. They could just unlock it in the moment very naturally. So I think of this as pedagogical reasoning, and that underpins intentional teaching. So being able to use a strategy deliberately in the moment to develop a child's oral language in a specific way. I've got some great suggestions later on. I can send those out afterwards if you want to know a little bit more about that idea of intentional teaching. So then the question, I guess, is how do we develop that dynamic pedagogical knowledge? So we know that it develops through repeated rehearsal practice, but also that it needs explicit attention and input. So in an earlier OLP study, we looked at the predictors of better knowledge, and we found that experience alone wasn't enough. So teachers with more experience, or even with more early years experience, didn't have better knowledge on average. But the professional development programme being tested in the RCT, that did improve pedagogical knowledge, so perceiving and naming specifically. And that programme had involved training in language supporting strategies, so the theory, and then support to apply these in practice through in-class mentoring. So that really suggests that we can't just assume that we're going to develop the knowledge that we need in practice and through experience. So we need explicit professional development, which includes the theory, but then which also supports the application to practice. Now, the big but here is that that professional development programme didn't improve interpretation. Now, that matters because, of course, interpretation was the most predictive of child language outcomes. So we haven't yet solved that puzzle. So we need to know more about how to develop pedagogical reasoning through professional development and in practice. And I think that we've got a lot of work to do, researchers and practitioners, to collaborate on exploring that further. So we really need much more research in this area. This study, the study I'm sharing with you tonight, we didn't explicitly explore how to develop pedagogical reasoning, but based on what we know already, we can make some sensible suggestions. So we need professional development, which explicitly links knowledge of language supporting strategies with knowledge of child development, and which then supports educators to put the theory into practice in the context of practice. So that might be things like structured opportunities to analyse language supporting practice. So either live or on video, for example, discussing what children need, what strategies were used and why they were used, how effective they were, what else might have been done, and so on. It might be making time for regular professional conversations, which unpack that day's interactions. So what did you do? Why? How well did it work? It might be what Juno Sullivan calls because and so conversations with parents. So being really explicit and saying, I did this with your child today because, or we're going to do gardening tomorrow so that your child develops their vocabulary around planting and growing. And then, of course, reflecting on and analysing your own practice. So essentially finding lots of different ways of exercising your analytical muscles. And doing these things really regularly and often so that that intentional practice comes naturally. So we want to make every moment count for children's language development. So really the question I want you and your teams to take away from today is, how might you exercise your analytical muscles over the coming week, over the month, over the year? Now, we don't have a lot of time tonight to really unpack this. We wanted to keep this session quite brief, but if any of you would be interested in attending a follow-up session, so maybe focus more on professional development and applying the findings in practice, then we'd be really happy to arrange that. So after the event, I'll email with a link to the recording of this evening and then a short survey. So you can let us know via the survey if you'd be interested in a follow-up session. Okay, so just then finally, before I finish, we always in research need to be transparent about the limits of our work. So I'm just going to touch on the limitations and also the next steps for developing the OLP. So the first thing to note is that this is a really light touch measure. So we only use 2 videos. We've got a very narrow representation of strategies and contexts. So I'd love to expand the range of videos. I'd love to test in different contexts. So this study was based in schools, but we need to extend to the PBI sector, to practitioners working with under 3s, maybe to pre-service practitioners. And we'd like to expand the expert benchmarking process. So I haven't had time to speak about that tonight, but in the audience, there are several people who've been helping us with that next stage of work. So really, we're in the very early stages of work. The OLP seems to be very promising so far. So the associations with child language are small, but they're there. And that's still notable, considering we only had information about the knowledge of children's reception class teachers, and bearing in mind even measures of quality of practice really have quite modest relationships with child outcomes. So we'll be working on developing and extending the OLP and learning more about how to measure interpreting pedagogical reasoning and how that might be developed through professional development. So if any of you would be interested in being involved in that, then please let us know this also in the survey. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to share with you this evening. I hope you found that interesting and useful so far. So I'm going to hand over now to our panel for comment and to bring the findings to life a little bit more. So I'll introduce each speaker in turn. We're going to start with Dr. Leslie Curtis, who's head teacher and head of centre at Everton Nursery School and Family Centre. And for 23 years now, Leslie has, with her colleagues at Everton, been continuing to pursue excellence for young children. So I've got a slide that Leslie is going to speak to. Over to you, Leslie.
Hey, hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me today. As a head teacher of a large nursery school that also undertakes training for early years practitioners, this research has continued to build upon our practice. I want to start by stating that I cannot emphasise enough the role of the early years practitioner when interacting with young children, especially through communication and language. The various activities you can see on the slide provide an overview of the variety of types of activities often observed in nursery and reception classes and early years settings. These activities provide a wealth of communication and language opportunities with skilled, knowledgeable practitioners who make it their aim to extend children's vocabulary through quality interactions within activities. It's important to note, though, that all the team work together in extending children's communication and language rather than just individuals alone, as a greater impact is when all the team work together to enrich children's language. From a practitioner's point of view, the Observing Language Pedagogy, the OLP instrument, provides an opportunity to analyse practitioners' interactions at a deeper level. As acknowledged by the authors in the research paper, this in turn enables early years practitioners to make real-time decision-making during activities. The authors also state that having an early years workforce capable of supporting young children's oral language skills is vital. I would agree that high-quality preschool provision is important for all children to access, but especially for children in disadvantaged areas. I'd also agree that the effects of the COVID pandemic on young children's language development does make it even more pressing that the preschool workforce are equipped to nurture these functional skills. From a provider point of view, it's refreshing that the research noted that early years educators make in-the-moment decisions, balancing multiple sources of knowledge to support them in using their strategies flexibly to maximise children learning or child learning in different situations. Often this can be overlooked in early years settings, but it is a skill that a number of quality early years teachers and early childhood practitioners have. I would also like to emphasise that the quality of the leadership of the settings also contributes to the early years workforce understanding of their role and how to impart their knowledge to the children they work with. Early years leaders work with their workforce to explore ways of extending children's communication and language. For example, leaders often observe their workforce in action and offer support to extend practitioners' practice further with opportunities to analyse pedagogical reasoning. This research paper references the use of video recordings of early years educators' practice, and this has enabled practitioners to review and reflect their own practice individually and with others. We've adopted this practice and found that staff have gained in both knowledge and further insight into child development, which has enhanced their practice. This in turn has given confidence to our practitioners about their practice, which the research paper references. The approach is based on the notion that being able to notice the features of an interaction are important for child learning, underpins effective decision-making, which in turn underpins effective practice. Our practitioners found that having the time to analyse your own practice in a safe environment as part of a professional development opportunity with colleagues was supportive. Both nursery teachers and early childhood educators have used the video opportunities of reviewing how they often recast children's vocabulary when engaging in a running commentary with children during activities. The video opportunity has given the practitioners time to reflect on and refine their practice further. Through our coaching and mentoring model, we now aim to draw on perceiving, naming and interpreting located within the research paper, with staff to extend their knowledge and practice further, particularly relating to the importance of professional analysis, knowing why as well as how. Many practitioners are often in an unconscious state of using these approaches in their practice. This research provides an opportunity to enable practitioners to be more consciously aware of the practices they use and why. I note that the research included mainly teachers in schools, but we use practice with all nursery practitioners that interact with the children, not just teachers. The research is located within schools, as Sandra stated, but this practice should also be extended to all types of early years settings. The challenge, though, is that the access to training in some settings is not always easy due to child ratios and staffing levels. However, building the training into mostly practice opportunities could prevent this. To conclude, I agree with the research paper's conclusions to ensure that early years educators are prepared to support young children's oral language, and that we need to invest in nurturing their early language related pedagogical knowledge, and also that educators should be supported in connecting their knowledge of language supporting strategies with knowledge of child development in order to understand why, as well as how, specific techniques supporting oral language development. I look forward to exploring this research further with my own staff team and other early years practitioners, both locally and regionally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. You managed to cover a great deal in 5 minutes there. That's fabulous. We could have had a whole presentation just about that content. Really, so many valuable points there. I think about the workforce more broadly, but I think it's just so helpful to have an example of you doing this in practice. So what this looks like for you, you know, that idea of using video to support analysis and to be unpacking that together with your team. So that's, I think it would be really great maybe to have a session where we had a little bit of time to explore that a bit further. It won't be this evening.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now. There we go, lovely. So that we can see everybody on the panel. You've lost the lovely pictures of everybody now, but I'm going to move on then to Beatrice. So Beatrice Merrick is Chief Executive of Early Education, which is a membership association for schools and settings and anybody working or studying or researching in the early years across the UK. And she's going to share some reflections with us. Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you to all the researchers. I think it's been a fascinating project. Sandra's asked me to talk a little bit about the policy implications, and in a way it's quite a big leap from the research, which is sort of focused on quite a specific topic, to then think, gosh, how do we then think about this in terms of policy implications? But I think if we look at, for example, what the Department for Education has been doing recently around CPD, it's clear that there are sort of policymakers realizing, oh, CPD matters. CPD makes a difference to outcomes, which is great. Stage one, tick. But this reminds us that actually what kind of CPD it is incredibly important. And so how do we translate these findings into something that informs the CPD that's offered, whether that's the national programmes which DfE are developed, whether it's what organisations such as Early Education offer, whether it's the kind of in-house development of staff that Leslie was talking about in terms of mentoring and coaching and reflecting with staff on what they do. And all of those might have very different answers. But I think it's perhaps not surprising, but you know, helpful to us to see that this research is saying what's important is not just what practitioners know, but it's not just the knowing what. Sorry, not just knowing the what and how, but the knowing why. So we want reflective practitioners. We want them to be able to engage, and you can see the follow through from that to the aha, and that's how I adapt it to my specific circumstances, this child in this context. So question one for, you know, a lot of the CPD out there is, does it give practitioners that opportunity to understand the why? Are we, at least for some perhaps less so for teachers, but for some less well qualified practitioners, are we simply expecting that we can kind of roll out a series of strategies and say, off you go, rather than realizing that they do need that additional background knowledge? They need to be able to contextualize, they need to be able to sort of pick apart why they're doing what they're doing. I think then that sort of asked questions about are the implications of this mainly in terms of ongoing CPD? Is it something that actually we need to think about in the context of initial training? So whether that's the early years teacher and PGCE level, or whether that's the level 3, which has just been going through a review. What expectations do we have of what skills practitioners should be picking up at those different stages? I think there's a really interesting question about, if this is kind of focusing on one aspect, can we generalize from that? You know, there's always that sort of rush to sort of think about how this fits with the bigger picture. But is that warranted, or should we do something similar looking at other aspects of learning? I mean, it seems plausible this would be generalizable, but maybe that's something that needs sort of testing. And does it work more with language and less with, you know, some other aspect of learning and development? So I think lots of interesting questions there, and we'll look forward to more from the researchers to say, you know, maybe this is how we need to think about this being embedded in CPD programs more widely.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. There, another really thoughtful few minutes of response there, and so many important themes. I was scribbling away while you were writing. I think just to pick up on the very last point, so there is a little bit of work that's been done in the domain of maths and fairly general adult-child interactions using video in this way, but in general most of that relates to older children, so there's not a lot of early years work that's been done. So I think that's really where we need to continue the development and see exactly as you say, so does this transfer? Lots of great questions there. So what kind of CPD, how do we build effective CPD, and that really important idea of just needing time for that analysis and reflection. I think in my experience, particularly with COVID this last year, when everyone's been so much in crisis and so busy, you do what you need to do for the next day. And actually as a professional, it's you really that loses out there. It's the time, your own time for professional development, for thinking, reflection that so often goes. So finding ways to protect that will be really important, I think. Lovely. Okay, I better stop talking, I think, and hand over to Kathy, our final panelist. So Professor Kathy Silver is an early years researcher. I'm sure many of you will know of her work already, so specialising particularly in the effects of early childhood education and care on children's development. So Kathy, over to you.
Thank you, Sandra. This research instrument, this assessment instrument, has established a link between pedagogical knowledge and children's learning outcomes. Other attempts to make an assessment have failed. They've not predicted outcomes. This one is predicting outcomes. So why? And I'm going to tackle that question. Why has this one succeeded? But it's been a long day and you're all tired. So I'm going to begin with a nice story. My friend, Lillian Katz, some of you will know her work, was flying from Chicago to Champaign-Urbana, which is where the University of Illinois is located, on a Friday afternoon, as one does. She found herself sitting next to a physics professor at her university, and they chatted. What was the goal of physics? And what was the goal of his job as a physicist and her job as a teacher? And it turned out their goals were 180 degrees apart. The physicist wanted to find universal laws that would apply in every single instance. And if you watch The Big Bang Theory, as I do, you'll know the physicist wants a law, a simple universal law that will always apply. And Lillian Katz said, I'm completely different. In my classroom, I want to know what I can do for this child in this moment who comes from this family, in this school, in this town. And they looked at each other and they realized they were 180 degrees opposite. Lillian went home, got her luggage, went to her computer and wrote a paper on the difference between universal laws, which are general, and particular strategies, which are local. And that's what this instrument is about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. Why do scores on the OLP predict children's learning? It's because the OLP simultaneously looks at the law, the strategy, ask a question, but it looks at it within the particular context of that child, those materials, that hot summer day. You can see that the boy's sweating. The OLP simultaneously gives the respondent the strategy within the context. What does the respondent have to do? They have to go into that video, grab out that principle, and then look at it. Okay, once they've grabbed that principle, then they can apply it in some other situation, some other context. And the OLP, by combining what is the strategy, but putting it in the context, this child, this teacher, this hot summer day in Illinois, the genius of it is it puts them together. Okay, I'm going to look a little bit at interventions and show you why they fail, because they don't take account of simultaneously the strategy and the context. Okay, scripted interventions, where you have a script, this material, you say this. They fail because teachers only learn to do this in this situation. That strategy should be escaping into the wild of the classroom, so they can do it in some other context. But teachers in scripted interventions do not learn to make it escape. So they only learn the strategy. Okay, what other interventions fail? Interventions that teach principles, generic principles, like the physicist, that will work in every situation. Ask questions. Another generic principle will be give feedback. This will fail too, because the teacher has this very abstract, general rule, law of nature. They have no idea, what time of day should I give feedback to? Which kind of child? When is the moment? So the interventions which give you just the simple strategy stripped down of the context, that fails too. So our interventions, learning from the OLP, have got to teach the teacher what is the strategy, what is the context, and they have to be able to play with both. So what's the future, Sandra? What's my challenge to you for your next assessment? Find a way to assess the degree to which the teacher who took your intervention and is taking your test, your assessment, can take a strategy in one context and apply it into another. You have to measure the degree to which you've taught her something that has escaped into the wild of the classroom. Another one would be to find out whether a teacher that you've taught about what to do with this boy in this class, with this school, what to do about some strategy, you have to take that boy and you have to have the teacher find another child that you might use in this same, another context for this particular strategy. So the future of assessment of whether we've really been successful in intervention is to find out whether what we've taught escapes outside the here and now of this strategy in this context into other strategies and into other contexts. So you must become the master of assessing escape. And that's the end.
Thank you, Kathy. Those of you who don't know Kathy will know now why I chose Kathy to conclude this seminar, because I can always absolutely rely on Kathy to explain my own work 100 times more beautifully than I can manage and to set me probably a research agenda for the next 20 years.
And the reason I like working in the same office with Sandra is research is fun. We don't do research to become famous, and we don't do research to make money. We do research because it is such fun.
Because it's fun and because it matters, Kathy.
Yeah.
You know, and I think I accept your challenge of finding out how we can make that knowledge of language learning strategies escape into the wild. And I think I would just add one thing. I think it is, you know, it's about, for me, interventions which respect that complex professional knowledge. That's what I think we're doing, you know, is you're talking about interventions that are scripted versus ones that are adaptive. And for me, that is about respecting what practitioners know, respecting the absolute complexity of that knowledge, and what is going on, even though an expert practitioner might make that look easy. So really, that's what I think we need to do, is build our interventions in a way that puts the educator as well as the child at the heart of what we're doing. Wonderful. Well, we've got precisely 3 minutes for questions. I did think it was probably a bit ambitious. I've got one question that was sent in by email, but we have one hand up. So USG, you have had your hand up for a little while. I'm going to just, I think, transfer this so that you can speak if you'd like to. Would you like to share your question with us? Has to unmute. This might well be my technological ineptitude, meaning that we can't manage this. Okay, I am very sorry if I'm doing something wrong. That means that we can't have you come join us, but hopefully we can receive your question by email or get in touch with us later. So is there anybody else? I do have one question which builds a little bit on what you were saying before, Leslie. I'll just pause a moment and see, is there anybody else that would like to ask a question specifically? Otherwise I shall jump in with this one. No. Okay, that I have to say is the downside of having so many people come to the seminars, is of course everybody's then terrified to come on camera and say something. But please do let us know what you would like to know further. So the question that was sent to me by email, Leslie, you touched on this. So it was this study was in schools. Would the findings also apply in other sectors? So I think really you've touched on that a little bit, Leslie, and I think it's a great question. I mean, my response, I guess, would be that we can't say for sure that the findings would be exactly the same if I replicated this study in the PVI sector. And that's why it's important for us to use the OLP in lots of different contexts. But practically, I would say absolutely yes. So the messages coming from this research are important, I think, for all educators of young children. And really we can transfer. There are still more that we need to know, but I think this idea of building knowledge, this idea of exercising your analytical muscles, finding time for that analysis, that reflection, making sure that you're accessing the professional development that gives you the theory to connect those two aspects together, as Kathy was saying. But I don't know, Leslie, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add to that. So you work very closely with your PVI colleagues. Do you have anything to add there?
I think it's just something that we've been working on for a couple of years now, going back to about 2016, 18, and certainly before COVID, but subsequently after. And I think it's just that the whole early years sector makes a massive impact on the primary school sector. And it's recognising that the whole early years sector is out there. It's not just nursery classes in primary schools or nursery schools. There are the private nurseries, there are the childminders, the voluntary groups. There are lots of educators who are very interested in how young children learn and want to access quality professional development for themselves so that they can make an impact on children. So it's just sometimes more difficult for people to access that training. We need to look at ways of being able to do that. So sometimes at the end of the day like this is a good time for people to access it in probably a lot of the early years sector, but then having it recorded is another way so that people can access it maybe later on in the evening or another time when they can have the flexibility themselves. I think it's looking flexibly at how we offer training opportunities for the early years sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's something I'd love to work with, well, with all of you, continue with our team, but, you know, those of you out there in the audience as well, we will need you to help us with this. So I think, and we're at 5 o'clock now. So that actually just leads us very nicely into another question that's come in from Caroline in the chat about how we're going to disseminate our work. So I'll just finish again by saying thank you very much, everybody, for coming at the end of a busy working day. Thank you again, Leslie and Beatrice and Kathy, for providing such thoughtful responses. You've given me an awful lot to go away and think about as well, and I hope the audience too. In terms of dissemination, the first thing that will happen, so after today, then everybody that's signed up for this session, I'll email with a copy of the report that's been launched today, so published today. It's on the Nuffield website, the recording of this session. So if you would like to use that in your settings, in any other way, you are really welcome to do that. If you'd find it useful, I would be delighted if you would. And we'll also be producing some more briefings for the sector, article in Nursery World, a few other places. So you should see us hopefully telling the story of this research out and about. But as I said, one other thing that we'd really like to do is to take the CPD aspect forward as well. So I'll include that survey with the link from today. And if you would be interested to coming along to another more practical session, then please do let us know, and you'd be very welcome. So I think I'll close us there and say then good evening, enjoy the rest of your evenings, and thanks again everybody for coming. It's been really great to have you all here.